Hello. Where is Mauricio? He's coming probably. There we go. Okay, so yet another ask us anything session. Today we are focused on functions as a service and platforms and building platforms and anything else that you might come up with. I cannot answer all your questions alone. That's why I always have a support from somebody who knows more than me about certain subject. And today that somebody is Mauricio from Diagrid, Dapper guy, which is hard to guess unless you
for the t-shirt. Did you say? I need to have one in Dapper in
Exactly.
the front, Knative in the back, that kind of stuff. So you will see me turning around all the time.
Okay, so people watching this, start typing your questions. And while you're doing that, Mauricio, why don't you introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Mauricio Salatino. I'm at Salaboy in Twitter or X or whatever you call it. I am working as a software engineer for a company that's called Diagrid. We help people with Dapper, but also running cloud native application at scale and designing and building, these kind of applications that runs on Kubernetes, outside of Kubernetes, multiple cloud providers, that kind of stuff. I've just published the book, so that's kind of one thing that I've been telling people about, like in Twitter as well. I'm super happy about that. I haven't had like a physical copy yet, but it's coming. It's going to Chicago, and I'm happy about that. And I have some big news for you, Victor. I'm just a cloud native ambassador as well. Yeah, now I became an ambassador as well. Like that's the first time that I announced it. So super happy. How about that?
There we go. Okay, then. Look, if you're going to be ambassador, I cannot not be ambassador. Then I'm an ambassador as well.
You need to be an ambassador.
There we go.
You need to be an ambassador.
I am. I was accepted. I was invited a few days ago. Yeah.
Oh, you are?
A few days ago.
There you go.
Yeah.
So we are 2 new ambassadors now. We will need to learn how to do that because I have no idea. So we will be probably learning and sharing stuff with people.
That's winging it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so people, start typing your questions. We're going to do our best to answer all of them. Sometimes the answer might be, I have no idea. Mauricio, do you know? And then he will say, I have no idea either. That happens. So let's go with Fitz. Here we go. So is platform engineering like building a DXP, digital experience platform for your internal developers as compared to building a DXP for your customers?
I would say yes. That's it. It's like building platforms that enable other teams inside the organization to do stuff. I had this discussion with Victor before. I believe that developer platforms are one thing, but usually platforms will have many, many different users, not only developers. I don't know, Victor, if you are still debating.
Yeah. I think that, the only thing I would change in this question is for your internal customers, not developers. Because very often teams make a mistake. Oh, I know what they need. And then you spend 3 years building it. And then you give it to developers and they say, no.
I'm not going.
Was I clear enough? I said no. And then you say, oh, I spent 3 years of my time, or we, a team, spent 3 years of our time. What shall we do? And then you go to CTO or CEO and say, you need to force everybody to use this. Yeah. And then you're the most hated person in the company. Don't do that.
That goes very wrong 100% of the time, right? Like platforms are not to push people to use tools that you think that they should be using. It's more about enabling other teams, and it's just basically looking into what tools are they using and providing automation, making sure that you're just removing all the unnecessary things that they are doing while they can just do it in a better or more automated way.
So yeah, it's IDP developer platform is for your internal customers. Do whatever they need you to do, and if they say no, you do it again.
Once you figure out that part of what they need and what tools are they using, I guess that the next thing is looking into APIs, right? Make sure that you define the right contracts for your teams to use, and just focus on APIs. APIs are the way.
And here's the thing, the same like with your external customers, it's going to fail big time the first time. It's going to be horrible. Nobody will want that. And you just need to keep going. That's the thing. Just like with external customers. I never saw a product that somebody released kind of for the first time, and I said, yeah, this is amazing, right? It takes time.
Yeah, and usually, how do you do that? Even with customers, right? Like you just focused on a very simple thing first, and then you expand from there, right? Like you just focus on in a use case that you know that it's going to be beneficial for your teams. Just implement that, figure it out if it's working or not, and then expand.
Okay, so now from Miroslav, I might be butchering somebody's names. Hello, how load balancing works in FaaS, like open FaaS?
That's a very good question.
Now you have, this is the expert. He knows everything about
Yes.
functions in general.
Definitely not open functions. I'm not an open function person, so that's a very,
it's
very good
Knative
question.
behind the scenes, right?
Is it running Knative then? Yeah, perfect. Then
Yeah.
I know that. Yeah. So basically, I assuming like if it's using Knative and Knative services, it will be using kind of like a networking layer that basically defines how to route traffic to different functions. And that basically allows you to configure different projects. Like maybe you want to use Istio, or you might maybe want to use something like a little bit smaller like Courier or something like that, or like your own networking layer for doing that. And it will depend on which networking layer do you install with Knative in this case, on how kind of like the load balancing will work. But it will allow you to define how much traffic do you send to each function and how that traffic is split into different services if you want to. So with these kind of projects, you have like low-level control on how traffic is routed to your containers. And I think that for some kind of use cases, that's pretty much what you need. But that's a Knative answer, not an open function, an open FaaS.
Miroslav, I guess that you're asking about open function. If the question is really about open FaaS, I don't even know what it is.
That's the thing. Open FaaS, I have no idea. Yeah.
But we will assume, unless you correct it in comments, that it's open function in questions. And he has more questions, actually. If we will compare different FaaS, like open function, Knative, etc., how to choose the right one. You want to give it a try?
Yeah. Again, I think it's like, I will just do my short take on this. It's like, what does your company needs, right? Like Knative, actually, if you look at Knative serving, for example, it doesn't provide you a functions experience out of the box. It gives you a bunch of building blocks to build that experience. So if you are planning to build your platform and exposing some interfaces for function developers, Knative serving will give you some of those contracts that you can share with other teams. Open functions, not open FaaS, open functions will give you more. It will give you the function experience that you can actually just give a team and they just can get started right away. It's not the building blocks, it's just a completely defined experience on top of a bunch of projects.
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, open function is using Knative behind the scenes. So, yeah. And also, I feel that very often, and this is probably not your case, Miroslav, but very often when people say functions, they mean serverless, and serverless can be
tricky.
Have different flavors. It's not only functions, right? Knative, for example, allows you to run anything.
Any container.
I would call it serverless as a container, exactly, scale to zero and all that stuff, right? And then function would be one flavor of it.
Yeah.
If I understand it right.
Knative has its own separate project for providing that functions experience that it's called Knative Func. And that Func project basically gives you a CLI to create like scaffold functions, in this case, like real functions, like small, code pieces in different languages that you can deploy. How do you deploy them? As containers, and how is being served to the users using Knative in this case. So it really depends on kind of like what are you looking for.
So, question for you, Mauricio. This is what, because it's been a while, I haven't checked. Knative functions, does it insist on one replica per request, or just like Knative can serve a number of requests for one instance, right?
Yeah. So basically you can configure concurrency. You can define how many requests a container, like an instance, can handle. And based on that, you can trigger the autoscaler. So it's not one request per instance, right? Like, no, that would be a little bit crazy. You will have too many containers. In this case, you can configure like concurrency.
So more from Miroslav. If I have Kubernetes with few worker nodes, I assume, how will load be spread across these nodes in context of FaaS?
That's a very, very good question. And at least if you're using Knative, right, like that would be handled by the Kubernetes scheduler, right? So Kubernetes will define how is that being, allocated into the different workers, which is something that Knative doesn't do. And I think that might be a very good kind of like community initiative to figure it out some other flavors on how to schedule these workloads and what happens when you run out of like resources, because that's the big problem with functions. When you are scaling, if you want to scale elastically, you will hit the limits of like your cluster, and Knative will not do anything about it.
But that's kind of the part where I like that Knative does not insist. It's not like Lambda in terms of one request per instance. So if you have and correct me if I'm wrong, you know better than me, Mauricio, this part, right? If you have cluster autoscaler,
Yep.
it will, couple of minutes later, it will scale your cluster. And while that is happening, your existing replicas of your function or serverless will still continue handling the load, right?
100%.
So there is not that, it's not like Lambda that a new instance, new VM needs to be spun up in a second, right? Because you can still handle the additional load with existing replicas, no?
Exactly, yeah. As soon as your current replicas can handle the load, you will need to wait for the new node to be scheduled. Whenever that's ready, your new functions will start being placed in there. But it takes time.
Okay, now we have changing the person, Josh. Long-time user of AWS Lambda and GCP Cloud Functions. What are good indicators that I should begin looking at a tool like Knative or self-hosted FaaS?
Do you want to start with that one? I will let you start. I can continue.
I have a general opinion that is not really directly related to FaaS, but equally applies to FaaS. I think if you can use SaaS something, right? Lambda, GCP Functions, Google Cloud Run, Azure Container Apps, EKS, AKS, GK, whatever kind. If you can use a service, SaaS, from somebody, and the price fits your budget and the needs and stuff like that, do that.
Yeah.
I'm strongly in favor for us to do less, not more.
Yeah.
So to me, self-managed something comes into play where I have certain, so I have different needs than what service is offering me. The price is too high. Performance is not good enough. I can do better. Right? Kind of, when you outgrow SaaS, is how I see it. I don't know what's your perspective, Mauricio.
Yeah, I think that like as long as you can pay for it, it's fine. The problem is that it might become too expensive. But compared with running a self-hosted solution, you need to actually like do the numbers there. I've seen like that people will get out of Lambda or cloud GCP Cloud Functions or whatever, mostly because they have some particular use cases that doesn't fit very well in there. So they need to have more control on how they run workloads. Maybe they cannot send data to a cloud provider. Maybe they need to meet some governance or policies in the companies that they need to run across cloud providers. So if you need to run across cloud providers, you don't have like something like Lambdas in another cloud provider that fits for both, and just build it once and then run it in multiple clouds. I think that's where this becomes more accessible for people to look into tools like Knative. But again, Knative, Kubernetes itself, it will give you the building blocks to build these experiences, not the entire experience, and then you will need to manage them. That's the other thing, right?
And also, this might be me being old-fashioned, call it, right? Yeah. I see services like Lambda for very special use cases, typically low traffic use cases. My head cannot wrap around. So if you have high traffic something, right? The model of instantiating a new instance of something doesn't matter whether it's Lambda function or something else. To me, and this is going back to the previous comment, right? Handling one request per instance is inefficient. If you have a huge load, now if you have batch processing, for example, or things like that, go for it. But I don't think it solves I don't think that there are many companies that have a use case that say everything is going to be Lambda.
Yeah, and even if they do, right, like those companies will be tied to AWS for a long time, right? Like it will be pretty hard to get away from there. I guess that companies looking into the Kubernetes space and all these, cloud native tools are more coming from that space where they want to rely their things on standards. They want to base their things on communities, not on vendor decisions, which, sometimes if you can pay and if you're okay with just tying yourself with the vendor, just go for it and use it as much as you can. And figure out their limits, right? Like if you figure out that Lambda cannot implement that, can help you to implement 80% of your cases, but 20% extra that you cannot do there, or it's not efficient, or you're paying too much, then looking into these solutions make a lot of sense.
That's also one of the reasons why probably people following this channel heard me many times. I tend to yell how I love Google Cloud Run, not Cloud Functions.
Yep.
And I think that's going back to your comment. One of the reasons, apart from working great and all that stuff, I like it is because it's built on top of open source. It's built on Knative. It's built on the same API. I can rely on that running in Google Cloud as a service, or tomorrow putting it in my cluster and running it myself, right? I feel that I have smaller vendor dependency with Cloud Run than with, let's say, Cloud Functions.
Yeah, the good idea, like the good thing about like even if you are tied to Google, at least you're running containers, right? Like you're building containers that can be run into different platforms. You can take the same container that you're running there in Google Cloud Run and just run it as a container in Knative in AWS. But of course, you're taking all this management on top of things. And it's funny because I mentioned this to Victor before, right? Like we have become very, very well at running things. Right? Like we are very good at running containers. We are talking about AWS Lambdas, running functions, but the whole experience is still a little bit bad. Like for function developers, it's a little bit pretty bad. At least in the in the Kubernetes space, we can do much better.
Oh yeah. We can talk about that. Somebody should ask about Dapper here in the comments.
Oh yeah, that's coming.
James, if you want a hybrid solution where we leverage FaaS for just a subset of functions for DevOps, where to start drawing the line for what to migrate? What's a good way to deciding eligibility?
Interesting. I'm guessing that the question is coming from an angle where you have identified some functions for your DevOps teams, and you want to start migrating those outside from the cloud provider. Is that the same thing that you're understanding from the question?
That's my understanding. Let's say that that's the question, and James can correct it in the comments.
Yeah. So I guess that if you're running kind of like in a cloud provider and you want to figure out which functions are the best to migrate out of that cloud provider and run that into in your managed functions service solution, I would say that you should start for the functions that you have that they have like a little bit more like strange requirements, right? If you need to do a lot of I/O, for example, like a lot of writing to volumes and have fast access to drive or something like that, like a distributed storage, maybe you figure out kind of like which functions are not working for your teams and just move those out first and figure out if you can improve kind of like that experience in your managed solution. And then connection and integration points, right? Like what are those functions doing? Are they calling kind of like local services, or they are interacting with like cloud provider services? Because if you have functions that are interacting with local tools that are not even running in a cloud provider, maybe those are the first that you need to migrate. It's database, I guess. Just put the functions closer to the data or the services.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so while waiting for more questions, why don't you tell us about Dapper? I cannot continue looking at the shirt without knowing what it is.
And then I will just go down so you don't see it anymore. Well, so no, I guess that how Dapper fits kind of like in the functions space, right? Like, again, we know how to run functions. Knative is one example. Open Functions uses Knative for running functions. And you can build your own functions experience on top of Kubernetes. At the end of the day, you will be creating a container and you will be running that in a machine somewhere, right? And that container will be running. I think that, again, we have understood how to do that pretty well in the cloud native community. But then the next step is how do you connect things together, right? Like how do functions talk to each other? how do functions talk to the infrastructure that is available, right? That's the website Dapper.io. That's the project website, and it's a CNCF project. We are like moving forward into the maturity levels, and I guess that what you do with Dapper is you expose an API to developers to interact with infrastructure and to connect functions together, which I think it's a pretty important thing to do if you are planning to build this functions platform that it's cloud agnostic, right? You want to make sure that developers can interact with persistent storage like databases or NoSQL databases as well, or emit events and consume events from different functions in a way that it's not tied to the available infrastructure. That's to say, like like Google, like the like in-memory database or Google PubSub or whatever, right? You want to build these applications and these functions to be as agnostic as possible from the cloud provider where they are running, and Dapper gives you those APIs and the tools for platform teams to configure and wire these APIs to the available infrastructure. I strongly recommend you to check the site there because we have a lot of examples, and with examples, usually you can like get the idea pretty fast. Have you used Dapper
The way
before?
I describe it, and I might be
Yeah.
completely wrong, so correct me, Mauricio,
Yeah.
is Dapper is when you, as a developer, you want to connect your code to something, a database, another function, another application, whatever, right? And you're saying, I don't know where it is, I don't care about it, just give me Kafka. I want to publish something to Kafka, don't ask me questions.
Yeah.
Would that fit somehow the...
I think that yes, but instead of saying I want Kafka, it's more I want to emit an event. I don't care if it's Kafka or RabbitMQ or Google PubSub. And you as a developer have the
Exactly.
APIs that basically says emit event or consume event or subscribe to these kind of events. And that makes it very easy to developers to build features instead of worrying about like adding a Kafka driver that works in production and just caring about the versions of Kafka. That doesn't really matter to developers. Developers want to connect things together, store data, retrieve data, emit events, consume events, get secrets, configurations, or whatever the application need, without worrying about where those things are stored or which components are you going to use, which I believe it's pretty important. Like if developers don't need to think about all that stuff, then they can actually spend more time building features. And now I can hide my t-shirt.
Yeah, to me, that sounds like evolution that started a long time ago. In terms that as time progressed, we started removing more and more stuff from the applications themselves, right? To me, the simplest example would be in the past, I had that problem that I needed to worry about TLS certificates for every single application that I had, right?
Yes.
And I'm talking either directly in code or in the container or in a VM or somewhere. And then we removed and said, okay, your application does not need to care about, I'm using TLS as example, right?
Yep.
Forget about it. Focus on writing the business logic of your application, right? And then with time, we are doing more and more of that, right? And then Dapper would be one example of, okay, you don't worry about events. I mean, you worry about publishing events, then subscribing to events. Don't worry about how that happens, where that happens.
Yeah.
It's all happening outside, right?
And it's all about like that, right? Like I always think about like I consider a developer myself, and I love APIs. I like using APIs. I love creating APIs. So I know how to deal with APIs. But imagine kind of like a fresh person coming out of university, and they are joining a team where they are building a distributed application. Now they need to learn about Kafka. How much time would they need to spend learning about Kafka just to emit a message and consume a message? And how much do they actually need to know about Kafka itself and how it works to do it efficiently? So it feels to me that developers can build functionality, and then platform teams can wire up this functionality, these APIs to the infrastructure that it's better suited to those applications.
And then you're going to realize that Kafka is great for production, but you cannot run it locally because it's just massively big, and then you're in big trouble or something like that.
Remember when you needed Zookeeper? I think that's not the case anymore. But like, what?
No.
I think that now they have a version.
I need to check Kafka again because I dropped all hopes for Kafka because of Zookeeper.
Hopefully, I'm not messing it up, but I think that they have a version without Zookeeper now. Are you checking? this is going to be it's live, so man, I can just not back up on that. But I
I'll
think
check
that they
it
have
while
a
you're
version.
answering the next question from Bogdan. And serverless framework, so many, pretty cumbersome to choose. How much do you have experience with serverless framework?
Like for example, that
No, I
serverless
think that
means
there
so
is a
much.
project
There's
called Serverless
something,
Framework.
yeah. But I think that he's asking like more generically.
Serverless yes, I'm guessing that he's referring to serverless.com. I'm guessing. And it's serverless.com, and I know serverless.com from years ago. I do not know where it is right now.
Uh-huh.
And back in the days when I did use it, it was more like a wrapper without really kind of, hey, this is a command that can create a scaffold for your serverless Lambda, right?
But it's a Lambda at the end of the day, right?
No, Lambda, and then there is a list of supported frameworks. But it's, at least back in the day, it wasn't like Knative that, no, I can actually run your workloads as serverless. More like a wrapper that helps you
Create the
interact
functions.
with, create the functions, exactly, things like that. Back in the day, I don't know today.
I would say that if you are in the Kubernetes world, check Knative. That will give you kind of like the first introduction on how to run things, like the running the workloads, and then the Knative functions. It's mostly like the experience there. Check openfunctions.dev as well. That's, I think that you can put the URLs there. But those projects will give you kind of those projects will give you an idea of what's possible today on Kubernetes land. And I know that there are some other frameworks out there as well. But again, always when I choose one of these frameworks or tools, I try to focus on the contracts that they are exposing, right? Again, Knative doesn't specifically talk on about functions in their CRDs, for example, while Open Functions, it's heavily based on that. They have their own CRD for defining what the functions is and how a function will be built and all that stuff. So it really depends on what you're looking for. How much are you planning to build, and how much how many resources do you have to maintain these tools as well, and how much time do you have to gain expertise in this? Because that's something that we tend to forget, right? Like we have been we have been in this space for a long time, right? Like Victor, and then we tend to forget how difficult it is to learn about these tools. It takes time, actually.
I forget until somebody reminds me, and then I have nightmares. We mentioned Kafka, and I remember you have no idea how much I hated Kafka because of Zookeeper, not because of Kafka. Zookeeper was just, I mean, I understand. And we still, Kubernetes has etcd, which is essentially the same thing. Yeah. It's just that I do not worry about etcd. And I had to worry about Zookeeper. So it's not that one is better than the other. It's just that etcd in Kubernetes is just, it's there. Not my problem.
Yeah, and I think that this is kind of like the same question, right? Like people is asking now, when should I use Lambdas? When should I use Knative, for example? And it's all about that. Who is running these things, and how much time do you have to gain expertise and run it yourself? And again, like the one that is being managed by someone will have limitations that the only way that you can overcome is by running your own, your own machines or VMs or clusters, right? And sometimes that's too expensive both ways, right? Like running the managed one might be too expensive for your company at this point, or building expertise might be expensive for you as well. It's a tough decision.
Yeah. We got the confirmation, No more Zookeeper.
There you go.
God.
There you go.
Cool. The world is a better place now.
I remember seeing kind of like a pull request in the repository, which was like, like a million line changes. Like, okay, now this is the Zookeeper-less version.
But, I understand completely why. So if I would be setting up something like Kafka, and there are many other things that require solutions like Zookeeper and so on and so forth. If I would be setting it up on myself on VMs, I understand completely why we need it, right? We need a distributed key value store that will guarantee certain things and stuff like that. So Zookeeper makes a lot of sense. However, what doesn't make sense is that, and you might disagree with me, right? If you're running it in Kubernetes, then Kubernetes already has Zookeeper-like baked in. We already have etcd, and then from my perspective, adding Zookeeper
into
in
Kubernetes.
parallel with etcd is such a waste.
Yeah.
Waste of everything.
Yeah. For me, I totally agree with that. For me, I think that the disappointment usually came when, like, for example, if you were building a product on top of Kafka, right? You're building a product on top of Kafka that adds a lot of complexity. Then you're using Kafka for exchanging messages across different pieces of the software that you're building. And then you provide this product as a self-managed thing that somebody will need to install. Now these teams will have multiple problems. One is maintaining your thing running, but also maintaining Zookeeper running, and Kafka in the middle, right? Like, so it becomes kind of like a cascade of things that you need to learn in order to use this efficiently. And that's a lot of time and a lot of money investment there. So I'm happy to see that. Yeah. Hey, there you go. I'm so jealous. I keep seeing people tweeting about this, and I haven't had my printed version yet. I'm so jealous. Thank you
Because
for
you're
sharing
cheap,
that.
you don't want to pay for it. Others people do.
No, I don't. Yeah, that's
You
so
could
true.
have bought it as well.
You know me very well, Victor. You know me very well.
Okay, so let's go. More questions, people, boys and girls, everybody. And while waiting for questions, okay, here we go. For Marco, what is your approach on securing APIs in terms of authentication authorization in Kubernetes clusters?
That's a very, very good question. I guess that's a thing that everybody building any kind of applications will need to deal with, right? Security on the APIs, and the question here is like APIs on like the Kubernetes APIs or like your application APIs.
I'm guessing that the question is about your application APIs, what application running in Kubernetes. But wouldn't that be the purpose why, among other things, why solutions like Knative are built on top of Istio, Linkerd, Kuma, whatever, service mesh? Now, today is a bit more complicated, right? Because in the past, I would say, yes, service mesh. That's a very clear answer, right? Maybe you will need additional things on top of service mesh, but service mesh for sure is the starting point. But now we have some of those capabilities are baked into networking like Cilium, right? So you might actually say, yeah, I'm going to do some authentication authorization, what's or not, in Cilium, which most likely is running in your Kubernetes cluster, whether you like it or not.
That's going back to Cilium, right? Like, is that running on cloud providers as well, right? Like they have.
Exactly. Yeah. In some cloud providers, I don't want to name them now because just not to make a silly mistake. But in some cloud providers, it is default, and in others, it's a like opt-in, like flag, right? You have an argument networking, like in AKS, I think that they call it. I'm not sure what they call the default networking, but you have -- network or something like that, and then you say Cilium, right?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So you just push the problem kind of like one level down. I'm guessing that for applications, you will be looking into more like like DEX, like that kind of stuff, or you do more like identity provider kind of stuff. So managing your identities and all that stuff. In CNCF, we have Keycloak, which was kind of like a Red Hat project that got donated. I got in a very heated Twitter thread the other day with Engin and some other folks about Keycloak. Keycloak is a very complex tool. It's very difficult to manage as well in Kubernetes, but it does a lot of things. So it really depends again on what your company is doing and if you actually need all these integrations with these protocols and all this stuff that Keycloak is handling. DEX, I guess that it's more like on the simple spectrum. Like I've seen a lot of projects using DEX. So yeah.
It's actually, the way I see it, you might need to think in two places, like how do I do authorization, authentication of the request coming in?
Yep.
And then between applications, what do I do, right? Which is probably more appropriate for service meshes. And then authenticate the user-facing Keycloak or whatever else you're using, right?
I always think about...
next one.
Go. Go. No, I think that platforms... And that's something that I'm not covering in the book, but I'm very aware that I haven't covered it. It's like, how do you bring identity into it, right? So identity for applications, it's all about that. You authenticate people, but also you need to get their profiles. you need to figure out who they are, in which groups are they allowed to work around, and which services can they access. So one thing is accessing things. The other thing is, are they supposed to be using this service, or what kind of access do they have for this particular service?
So from Mark, when should an org make a platform team and why? What are the driving factors? And is FaaS an important part of this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mark. Mark is my founder from Diagrid, so I'm happy that he's asking these kind of questions.
Infiltrated.
So I need to be careful with the answer. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, so from my experience, I don't know, and I think that here is like very important to get your experience as well, Victor, because I think that if you're adopting Kubernetes, you are building a platform in a way or another, right? Like if you're running on top of Kubernetes, if you're running your workloads on top of Kubernetes, you will need to make certain decisions that will become part of the definition of what the platform is. You want other teams to adopt, your Kubernetes platform to run your workloads and to deploy your applications. And all the decisions about which projects do you install, how do you configure your clusters, who have access to these clusters, and how do you expose these clusters to other teams are the main driving factors to push people to build these kind of platforms. I think that FaaS, or building a FaaS experience on top of a Kubernetes-based platform, is also like something that it's coming. And I've seen a lot of companies doing this, but it's for very mature companies that already solved a bunch of other things like observability, security, CI/CD pipelines on how to deploy things, or GitOps. And building a FaaS experience will take you a little bit longer, right? Like it's much more complicated to think into terms of experiences. But I can feel that at least in the cloud native communities, these discussions are coming, and they are becoming pretty relevant now. So I'm expecting a lot of tools to be being built in this space, and that's why Dapper is kind of like playing a part in that part of platform building. What's your experience? What's the main driving factor for building a platform?
So I think that the size is one of the most important factors, right? If you're a small team, relatively small company, if you're just starting, don't go there. Don't use Kubernetes. And I'm a Kubernetes freak, but don't go there, right? Use Vercel or Fly.io, or there are a bunch of Heroku-like services. And the problem with those services is that you cannot do what you want. You need to do what they expect you to do, and then the life is beautiful, right? But that model starts to fail the more you grow, right? Because if you have history behind you, you're not going to rewrite your application just to work well in Vercel or Fly.io or whatever, right? You're not going to change all your processes and so on and so forth. And when that happens, and that usually is related to size, then you need to start building your own platform. And even if you use SaaS services like Google Cloud Run or what's not, right? You still need somehow as a least possible minimum to tie it all together, right?
Yeah.
Because the way I see the problem that we are having is that most of the tools are geared towards ops, right? Kubernetes is a low-level building blocks type of solution, right? That makes perfect sense to people dedicated to Kubernetes and makes zero sense to developers. It's kind of like, to run your application, you need to define a deployment, a service, an ingress, and a virtual service, and this and that, and you go crazy because those are the building blocks. So if you are, let me put it this way, you need a solution, right? You don't need building blocks. And you either use a ready-to-go solution and say, I'm going to do exactly what it asks me to do, or you're going to use building blocks. And if you're using building blocks, you need to assemble them into something that makes sense, because core Kubernetes by alone makes zero sense.
Yeah.
Zero sense.
But then I think that if you look into Vercel, if you look into AWS itself, right, there are like big jumps on the abstraction levels, right? Like what are the things that you can do, and how much time do you need to spend learning about how to use these tools? If you look at AWS, it's just a bunch of building blocks that you can use to run your applications and to do stuff, right? So even if you look into this, every time that you look into building blocks, you will be ended up building a platform, which basically means a set of practices around how to use these tools for your own organization. And most of the time, what people is doing nowadays is building APIs on top of these decisions, on saying, I will use buckets for storing this information, and I will use SQS for sending messages across different applications. These decisions, when you put them together and when you start creating automation around that, that becomes a platform. So I would argue that there are tons of companies doing that.
Okay, from me to Bogdan, it's not really a question, but a message that he couldn't post a message. OpenWhisk, Fission, Nucleo, FN, Kubeless, Iron Functions. I don't even know most of those.
There are tons of them. Yeah.
I mean, I know by name, but not by experience.
Yeah. I do know them by name as well. OpenWhisk is I think that was based on IBM as well. One of the first thing that IBM started pushing for in the function space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I used it years ago, but I forgot about it. From James, I do wonder how to best utilize FaaS services strictly on the ops or CI/CD side to prove business value before suggesting application changes. If you already do Argos, GitOps, where can FaaS come in?
Yeah, well, it just plays along with that, right? Like if you're looking into CNCF tools that runs on top of Kubernetes, it actually works pretty well with those tools, right? Like because at the end of the day, a function will be another resource that you store in your GitHub repository, and whenever you sync with your cluster, that function will be deployed in there, right? Again, Knative function does that, and it allows you to have these declarative definitions of functions that can be deployed into different environments using a GitOps approach with Argo, with Flask, or with any other tool that you want to use. I guess that's also the advantage into looking into tools like Knative and open functions, that they are all based on the same principles that other tools in the Kubernetes space. That basically means that they should play nice together, right? They just extend your existing experience, providing some higher level abstractions, but they work with all the other tools. Because if they do not work with all the other tools, then you need to spend time gluing things together, which is something that we are trying to avoid.
So essentially, FaaS and GitOps like Argo, they serve completely different purposes. FaaS is how do I run my code, right? And this is how do I actually translate what you have in Git with that something to that something, right? How do I synchronize it?
Yeah, I guess that the question it's a little bit more about like, can we deploy functions using GitOps? I would say yes. That's kind of what I was trying to answer. But then if you want to use functions in the space of GitOps or CI/CD, you actually can, right? Like again, like a function can be a container that it's being managed by Knative, so you can implement some glue functions to connect some CI pipelines if you want to.
Okay. Okay. Here we go. Back to the very beginning. What is FaaS? We never said what is FaaS.
We don't, and we have a lot of assumptions, I guess. We just start talking about things. Functions as a service, I would say, right? And functions as a service, coming from my personal background, is mostly just providing the functionality where, as a developer, I can create a function, and I will have a place, or like a platform in this case, where I can send my function and that will be executed. And then the question becomes, okay, what is the function able to do besides running? How can it connect to all the other things that are floating around? How do you, like, the idea of functions usually is to have like small functionality, right? Like it's not going to be a big monolith doing a bunch of different things. It's much more focused. And if you go into that model, then you will have tons of different functions doing little different things. So you will need to connect them together. One option is doing event-driven functions, so they connect using events, or they connect by looking into files or doing batch processing or just being orchestrated by an orchestrator. So when I think about FaaS, I think about like building that experience that allows teams to say, this is my function, I want to send it somewhere that it will run, and that place that it's running the functions will have all the mechanisms to connect functions together. So you can build more and more complicated software by using a collection of functions together. How would you explain FaaS to someone that had never used it?
So I like to start by explaining serverless and then dive into functions, right? Serverless is I want to run my application. I don't care about anything else. Don't ask me about servers. Don't ask me about networking. That's just kind of completely abstracted from me. And serverless can be done by an external provider like AWS, or it can be done by a different team in your company. Right? Team can provide a serverless solution where, in terms that, hey, give me the definition of what your application is, and don't worry about the rest. And then within serverless, we have functions as a service, which would be a flavor of serverless, which functions are very small, usually pieces of code that respond to a single request, meaning that if you have 7 API endpoints, you wouldn't put them in one application, but 7 functions, right?
Yeah.
But then you can have containers as a service, which would be a different flavor of serverless. But then it could be, functions can be at the same time containers as a service.
Yeah.
Or containers can be, as a service, can be something that is bigger than a function, right? Which I guess is, I would guess that if somebody else, stop me at any moment, Mauricio, right?
Yeah.
Knative would be serverless solution for containers as a service when managed by somebody in your organization. And then Knative functions would be still containers as a service, but also functions as a service, more focused on a small piece of code running.
I think that
while Knative can run anything, right?
Yeah. So if you remove Kubernetes from the picture, when I think about functions as a service, I think about like a developer experience and a programming model as well, right? You are thinking in terms of it's more like a programming model, right? And when we talk about functions, that's a functional programming model. But when you think about functions as a service, it's how can you run these functions that you're defining into kind of like a runtime that takes care of everything else besides coding the function itself. You just code the function, you just provide the function package or something, and this platform will run it for you. But you need to be, but the platform is optimized for that programming model as well, right? So again, like as Victor was mentioning, kind of like one piece of functionality and how do they connect together needs to be provided by the platform.
So 13 minutes. Let's see whether we can go through all the rest of the questions and whatever comes. So around of Kafka, just interesting. What MQ from your perspective is better adopted for Kubernetes and has good operator deal with it?
That's a very good question.
Shall I?
If you want to start, I have experience with RabbitMQ, and that was quite okay-ish. I kind of liked it in a way, but Kafka is pretty popular as well, so I would be like split half and half on that.
Yeah, I see kind of Kafka and RabbitMQ in a same category. And then I think on the other side of the spectrum, I would mention Nuts. That's a very lightweight, very... I don't know, you can probably run it outside Kubernetes, but very much lightweight Kubernetes-like. And I tend to compare Nuts to and Kafka. I see Kafka more like Oracle for databases, right? It's a piece of event-based application that can handle all your events coming from everywhere, right? While Nuts, you can easily run each Nuts for a different application if you want to, right? Something smaller.
Interesting to mention that. Interesting to mention that in the Kubernetes space, I've seen a lot of implementations where they use Nuts for multi-cluster communications, right? And I've seen that like several times in different companies, mostly on the financial space, that they basically run different clusters in different places, maybe different regions, and then they have kind of like Nuts communication for eventing across clusters. And at some point, like I was surprised to see how many of those implementations are out there. I'm not saying that Nuts is perfect, but I've seen it a lot being used in that space.
What is your opinion about reuse of Kubernetes RBAC for application out? Better if you answer this because I'm going to start yelling.
I think that you should.
I have a very simple answer.
Yeah, no. My answer is no. I guess that, definitely not. Again, like coming from a developer perspective, I would never think about it in that way. I would think about like identity and access control and all that stuff from my applications in a completely separate plane. I don't know you, Victor, if you would mix those two things, but I kind of see your face and definitely I can feel the answer.
Kind of assuming that the question is about RBAC, how humans access. No, this is RBAC for application out. No. If
No.
the question would be RBAC for how humans access clusters, that would be a different thing.
Yeah.
My answer would be don't do it. That's why we have GitOps and use RBAC to access cluster for break glass situations. But for application authentication, definitely no.
Yeah, I think that you would be mixing kind of like the platform where your applications are running with the actual applications themselves, and those things needs to be separated. Unless you have a very specific use case in mind. Yeah.
Exactly. Do we have a common standard for container serverless? It seems like common standard is still mostly Kubernetes, but not higher level services.
Container serverless. Yeah.
I mean, container, serverless as packaged in container images, I'm guessing. And so here's the story, and then you jump in, Mauricio.
Yep.
The way I see it is that it's definitely Kubernetes, where it's running, definitely. Now, the question is whether you see it or not, right?
Okay.
So my good example for container serverless, container as a service, serverless containers is Azure Container Apps. You will not even see Kubernetes being mentioned over there. I know it's run by Kubernetes. I know it's Kubernetes behind the hood and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Same thing like with Knative. If it's done by ops, right? You don't have to even know that it's Kubernetes. Why would you know that? Kind of, here's my application, run it.
Yeah, exactly. I tend to think that that's kind of where we're heading, right? Like companies cannot deal with all the complexity sometimes of learning about Kubernetes. Maybe some specialized teams can learn about it, but we are going towards this space where more and more people know how to create containers and how they have the platforms just to run containers in a serverless fashion. I don't think that there is a standard besides the container itself, which I think it's a pretty good one, right? Like now you can run in most cloud providers, just give them a container and they will run it for you. Doesn't matter how. And that's kind of like the whole point of it. Yeah.
Okay, Christina, as a developer, I might not need to know Kafka and how to manage it. Cool. But what if I'm on the platform team and I need to upgrade? How would I do it without having to get the developer involved? I'm even confused with the question. I don't know why would you involve the developer.
Well, you will need to involve that's the thing, right? Like, and that's why I was trying to explain what Dapper is doing, right? Because the developer who is building, features for their applications, they will have a Kafka driver or a Kafka client inside their code. So if you want to upgrade the Kafka that it's running on production, you need to make sure that every application that it's connecting to Kafka has the right driver. The Dapper might be kind of like one of solution there. Like you can build your own abstractions, right? Like, but Dapper is already providing you these abstractions for you, right? Like as a platform team, you will be upgrading Dapper and the application code will not change. Because again, the application will be using APIs that are not going to change even if the infrastructure changes. I think that kind of like line, I think it's becoming more and more important. What happens when you're in a platform team and you need to upgrade, components that will impact in some way or another to the applications that are being running? Having kind of like a clear line there. This is platform, responsibility, and this is developer responsibility. It's pretty important to improve kind of like development speed and all that kind of stuff. So thank you, Christina, for the question.
So in other words, developers shouldn't. There is no strong need to know that it's Kafka. Kind of like I'm publishing events, and you make sure that goes wherever it should go, and it's up to date, upgraded, what's not.
But it's the same for Google Cloud, right? Like when they are just upgrading Kubernetes, they are just doing it without you don't really need to know which version of Kubernetes you're using, right? And you shouldn't be if you're using Google Cloud Run, even better, right? Like they don't even know which VMs are they using. I don't care. As soon as you run my container, it's fine. As soon as I don't need to change my application every time that you upgrade, life is good.
Okay, 6 more questions. Sorry, minutes, not questions. We have many hook calls as part of our automation. We're looking to offload some of that and shrink infrastructure cost. Lambda functions to replace Kubernetes control plane, API, CRDs, and so on and so forth. Go for it.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
We have some explanations rather than questions from Yortis about what to use as a message bus or Q bus. Nice. Okay, Gwoden, still confused if FaaS is geared towards developers or making the job easier for ops.
Yes. Okay. I guess that to answer that question, because I guess that Victor, like we need to explain this, right? Like we are always coming back from the Kubernetes point of view, right? That basically means that when we talk about projects like Knative, there is a big ops requirement that basically means that the operational team will need to run Knative itself. But in general, these projects are going kind of like providing you like higher level abstractions that will make the life of the users easier because they need to know less about the mechanisms that are being used to run things. FaaS, if you go to like AWS Lambdas, it's very heavily related to how developers create these functions, right? So it's actually has like that developer focused on saying, if you want to create a function, this is what you do, and this is what you have available for that function to perform some operations. At the same time, if you're running in AWS, you don't really need to care about like how to operate the functions runtime. But if you are in the Kubernetes land, then you will probably need to install a couple of tools to scale the functions up, to route traffic to functions and all these things. So again, it's both the programming model and the operation side if you want to run a self-managed solution.
The way I would rewrite that statement is, I think that FaaS makes it easier for ops to enable developers.
Yeah. Well, and platform teams, right? Like it's one way of promoting a programming model that will enable developers to ship more features, right? Like it will make it simpler. And if think about this, right? Like if you need to code your function and you have a way to deploy that function so that function can run, it's much easier than asking your developers to create the application, create a container, create YAML files, know how to connect to a cluster, and then deploy that, right? It's like it's a simplified experience to do all that stuff, and including a programming model that is very specific to functions.
Okay, more for Gwoden. With serverless, you don't have to care if FaaS runs on Kubernetes. So what does Kubernetes do for FaaS?
Interesting question. This is just we are bordering kind of like philosophic questions now. I think I love this. Yeah, I really love this. So yeah, so again, it's like going back to your point, Victor, right? Like it's like ops teams enabling other teams with runtimes, right? So if you're using Kubernetes, go for it.
Sorry. Yeah, so somebody is providing FaaS functions as a service or something else as a service. Somebody is giving that service to somebody else, right? Now, that somebody can be AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. And you as a user, you don't care whether they're behind the scenes, they're using Kubernetes or something else. Now, I would argue that if I would start today to build functions as a service myself, I would use Kubernetes because that's the most logical choice, right? Unless you're super special like Google, right? Now, so for an end user, it doesn't matter whether it's Kubernetes. That's the point.
That's the point.
Yep. Now, if you Gwoden, for example, if you're providing the service and not Google, then it does matter to you because you're guaranteeing the uptime of that service, and you need to make choices. Where will it run? How it will run? What needs to be? How do you observe it, and so on and so forth, right? So for a service provider, it matters. For the service user, nothing, zero.
Yeah.
That's my take on it. I don't know whether Mauricio you would argue against that, but
no, I think that like just to clarify on that like last part of the question, what does Kubernetes do for FaaS? Kubernetes provides like a runtime space for FaaS, and it provides also like some building blocks to build your own FaaS experience. Because sometimes you don't just want to use Lambdas, you want to build your own experience and provide that experience to your teams. Kubernetes will be part of that answer for some companies.
Okay, last question. Sorry, guys and girls. We are almost at the top of the hour from probably Yordis. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Where do you see FaaS ecosystem going now with products like Wasm Cloud?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I kind of like that. And I guess that's the same, right? Again, it doesn't really matter where your functions are running as soon as you are okay with that runtime. right? In the case of Wasm Cloud, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on Wasm Cloud at all, but then you just need to provide some Wasm files so they can run, right? So in this case, it's like, it's not I'm building a container, you run it. In this case, you will need to make sure that you can compile to Wasm so they can run your functions for you. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But then the question becomes of, one thing is that you can run Wasm code, but the other thing is what operations these functions are enabled to do, right? And also the fact that Wasm Cloud will run the functions in themselves, right? Like in this case, you are okay with them running your code.
I have slightly negative opinion of Wasm today. I will change that tomorrow. I promise. Okay. So I believe that Wasm is a better model to run than containers. Not incredibly better, but better model than containers. Okay. But with containers, we built an ecosystem. Yeah. Right? We have service meshes, we have networking, we have storage, we have, there is Knative, there is Dapper, there is Crossplane. There are, just look at the CNCF landscape and you say 98% of that is all built for containers in Kubernetes, most likely. Now, what I'm missing, and this is not directly related to that question, is Wasm, great. It replaces containers, excellent. Now, Wasm will have to figure out which path to take. One, can I run it in, either I run it in Kubernetes in a way that it can leverage all the other good things that we have in the ecosystem, option number one. Option number two, build your own ecosystem that is equivalent. Not the same, I'm not saying the same, not necessarily equally big, but there are so many things. I remember, to me, it's like similar. It reminds me of the early days of Docker, right? When Docker started its Swarm. Swarm was great, but it never got to the point that it gives me everything I might ever need.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's kind of like that's kind of what I'm waiting for, right? Like just to see how the Wasm community leverages like the CNCF ecosystem. Because the moment that we see that, the moment when Wasm becomes kind of like another option, right? Like you can run containers or Wasm workloads, which you can see like Wasm Edge is doing that. Open Functions Dev already support Wasm Edge, like as a runtime. But still, and I have seen some very cool demos about like Wasm using the Dapper APIs, and I'm regularly meeting with people that it's in that space of trying to connect Wasm functions using generic APIs and all that stuff. But I still, as Victor mentioned, I do not see kind of like a fully integrated ecosystem for this. The moment that I see this, I will be completely sold on. Now we have Wasm and containers running side by side, sharing the same ecosystem. And that takes time, of course. So we'll need to wait.
So my comment was in no way to discourage people from evolving Wasm. I think it's amazing. Just not today. We're at the end. Thank you, Mauricio, for coming. Thank you, everybody, for asking questions. See you
in
later.
KubeCon. If you're
I was about to say
hello.
We will not do this AMA session for a couple of weeks because I will be at KubeCon and then traveling. But as soon as I'm back home, another Thursday session. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you, folks.